Power can command armies, it can bend nations, it can even change religion itself. But power cannot stop decay. And for King Henry VIII, decay came slowly and cruelly. The man who once shattered the Catholic Church, who executed wives and friends alike, who ruled England with iron and fear, spent his final days rotting alive, trapped inside a body that had become his worst punishment. Today we step into the last horrifying weeks of King Henry VIII, when the most powerful man in England was no longer a ruler, but a corpse that hadn't yet been buried. Before the rot, before the stench of death, there was greatness. King Henry VIII, the radiant monarch who once dazzled Europe, was not always the monster he became. In the early years of his reign, Henry was the embodiment of youth and power. He was tall, over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, with fiery red hair that gleamed in sunlight like copper flame. His eyes were sharp, confident, almost arrogant. He spoke 5 languages, wrote poetry, composed music, and could outdance any noble in court. To the world, he was not just a king. He was a living symbol of divine rule. Ambassadors who met him returned home describing a man fit to be a god. He was athletic, charming, and disarmingly intelligent. When he rode through London, commoners would cheer as if heaven itself had crowned him, and for a while, he truly believed heaven had. But behind the charm lay something darker, a hunger that could never be satisfied. Henry's life revolved around one obsession: control. Control over his people, his court, and most of all, his legacy. In a world where kings were judged by the sons they left behind, Henry's reign was haunted by one cruel twist of fate. He could not produce a male heir. For years, his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, bore him children. All but one died in infancy. The surviving child was a girl, Mary. But to Henry, that wasn't enough. The cracks in his royal image began to spread. He blamed Catherine. He blamed the Pope. He even blamed God. And soon, he decided to fix it in the only way a king like him could, by breaking the rules of heaven itself. He severed England from the Catholic Church, centuries of faith and tradition destroyed because one man wanted a son. He created a new church, the Church of England, with himself as its head. And when Rome cursed him, he responded with executions, burnings, and excommunications. But divine rebellion comes with a price. Each wife he took after Catherine, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and finally Catherine Parr, brought him deeper into guilt and paranoia. 2 were executed, 1 abandoned, 1 dead in childbirth. The man who began as the Golden Prince was now feared as a tyrant. By his mid-40s, Henry's mirror no longer reflected the radiant youth of his coronation. His face had swollen, his eyes were sunken, his smile had rotted away with his conscience. The very body that had once symbolized divine power was turning against him, and soon it would begin to rot from within. On January 24, 1536, the mighty King Henry VIII, then 44 years old, prepared for a jousting match at Greenwich Palace. He had done it 100 times before. The court loved these tournaments, the cheering crowds, the gleam of armor, the glory of a king proving his strength. Henry mounted his horse, lowered his lance, and charged, but this time, something went wrong. The horse stumbled. Henry fell. The full weight of the animal, nearly 1,000 pounds, crashed down upon him. The impact was catastrophic. He lay unconscious for 2 hours, bleeding internally, his leg crushed and torn open. Courtiers panicked. Whispers spread that the king was dead. When he finally woke, groaning and gasping for breath, the wound on his leg was already blackening. At first, it seemed he might recover. But the wound never truly healed. It became a constant, festering ulcer, leaking pus and blood, reopening every time he moved. The pain was unbearable, and the infection unstoppable. Physicians of the Tudor age didn't understand bacteria. Their treatments were a cruel ritual of agony. They lanced his leg daily, drained it with hot irons, and packed the open flesh with herbs, wine, and honey. They called it cleansing the wound. But every time they pierced his skin, they drove infection deeper. The once athletic king began to bloat. His legs swelled until his boots had to be split open to fit. His face puffed, turning red and mottled. He developed constant fevers and headaches, and his temper, once fiery, became volcanic. By 1540, Henry could no longer walk unaided. He needed servants to carry him up and down stairs. He had a special device, a hoist system of ropes and pulleys, built to lift his massive body from bed to chair. Even sitting caused pain. The ulcered leg leaked so badly that his chambers reeked of rot. The royal tailors struggled to hide his disfigurement. Beneath his jewel-studded robes, his flesh was decaying. Courtiers described the stench as loathsome and abominable. Some whispered that it was divine punishment, that the man who had broken with Rome was now cursed by God himself. Henry's appetite, once immense, grew monstrous. He devoured meat and sweets daily, desperate to fill the emptiness gnawing at him. But each feast only worsened his health. He grew heavier, breathless, swollen beyond recognition. By now, the king's body was a prison, his mind a battlefield. He lashed out at anyone who defied him. He executed advisors, nobles, even old friends, accusing them of treason, heresy, or imagined plots. But the truth was simpler, darker. The man who had once conquered nations was now at war with his own flesh. His body, once his weapon, was turning into his executioner. And deep within that unhealed leg, gangrene was quietly spreading, eating through muscle, into blood, and soon it would reach the heart. By the mid-1540s, the King of England no longer resembled a man, but something that had once been one. His courtiers spoke of him in whispers. No one dared meet his eyes for too long. The smell of infection clung to his presence like a curse, heavy, sour, and unmistakable. His physicians called it a foul humor of the leg. But they all knew it was worse. The infection had spread into his blood. Modern historians call it septicemia, blood poisoning, a death that creeps inch by inch, turning the veins themselves into rot. The pain was relentless. His leg throbbed like a living thing, oozing and pulsing with heat. The wound refused to close, no matter how much honey, oil, or wine they poured into it. Sometimes the ulcer burst open during meals, and still, Henry ate. Every day was a battle between agony and rage. When pain ruled him, he became a beast. He screamed at servants. He hurled goblets at walls. One wrong glance could mean imprisonment or death. His temper was no longer the anger of a man, but the madness of someone dissolving from within. And yet, the court played along. They bowed lower, smiled wider, praised louder. Because in Tudor England, to anger the king was to invite execution. They called him Majesty. But in truth, they feared the rotting god who sat upon the throne. Henry began to withdraw from public life. He spent hours alone, staring into the fire. Some nights his attendants heard him muttering, not prayers but arguments, conversations with people who were no longer alive. He spoke to Thomas More, whom he'd executed years before. He cursed Anne Boleyn, the wife he had beheaded. He asked forgiveness from Jane Seymour, the only wife he claimed to have loved. And then he would weep. Guttural, trembling sobs that shook the room, only to rise again the next day, crueler than before. His mind was breaking under the weight of pain and guilt. Some say he became convinced that God had abandoned him, that his suffering was punishment for tearing apart the church. Yet others whisper he saw it differently, that his rot was proof of his divine trial, that he was a second Job tested by the heavens. To Henry, he was still chosen, even as his body betrayed him. But his mind could not lie forever. As the infection deepened, he began to lose sleep. He'd pace for hours, dragging his leg, gasping for breath, mumbling curses at the empty air. The ulcers grew so foul that attendants had to burn herbs and sprinkle rose water in the corridors just to survive the smell. Even his dogs, once his loyal companions, avoided his bedside. And in that isolation, the king who ruled a continent found himself surrounded only by two things, his pain and his ghosts. By 1545, the King of England had become a prisoner within his own palace, not by guards or chains, but by his memories. Henry's chambers at Whitehall were kept dim, curtains drawn, fires burning day and night, though their warmth could not cut through the chill that settled in his bones. The infection in his leg had spread so deeply that fever came in waves, carrying with it visions. Servants whispered that the king spoke to shadows, that he saw faces in the walls, that he woke at night shouting the names of the dead. It began, they said, with Anne Boleyn, the second wife he had adored and then destroyed. Executed on charges of adultery, witchcraft, and incest, accusations most believed false. In the silence of his sleepless nights, Henry began to hear her voice. Soft, mocking, whispering from the dark corners of the room. Do you remember me, my love? Some claimed he would cry out in rage, ordering guards to find her, as if she had returned to taunt him. But no one could see her, only him. Then came the others. Thomas More, who had refused to acknowledge Henry as the head of the church. Thomas Cromwell, the minister who had built Henry's empire, and whom Henry had destroyed in a fit of paranoia. Even Catherine Howard, the young wife he executed for infidelity, only 19 years old. In fever dreams they gathered by his bedside, silent, pale, watching. Some nights he screamed for them to leave. Other nights he begged their forgiveness. His attendants tried to keep it secret. They said the king's mind was clouded by holy visions. But the truth was simpler. Henry was being devoured, not just by disease, but by guilt. The court chaplains urged him to confess. He refused. He would not show weakness even before God. Instead, he ordered endless prayers for his soul, not his repentance, but his redemption. He wore a gold crucifix at all times, clutching it until his knuckles went white, demanding that priests pray beside his bed through the night. Still, he found no peace. Because every prayer brought back another face. Every whisper of, "Forgive us," echoed with the screams of those he had condemned. His nights became a theater of ghosts, and his days, an endless parade of paranoia. He suspected everyone around him of betrayal. He accused his final wife, Catherine Parr, of heresy and treason because she dared to speak of faith. She was saved only by her quick mind, agreeing that she was his humble student, not his rival. Even then, Henry's eyes followed her like a predator, unsure if its prey still lived. By now, few dared to approach him at all. Courtiers avoided his chambers. Servants rushed through tasks without meeting his gaze. The King of England, once surrounded by music, laughter, and celebration, now lived in silence. A silence broken only by whispers that weren't there. And somewhere between his fever and his guilt, Henry began to understand the one truth no crown could protect him from. He was dying. By the winter of 1546, the King of England was no longer truly alive, only decaying in slow motion. Henry's chambers had become unbearable. The air was thick with the scent of rot, so foul that even courtiers covered their noses with perfumed cloths before entering. Rose petals were scattered across the floor. Incense burned day and night, but nothing, not the finest oils, not the prayers of priests, could mask the smell of a dying god. The wound on his leg, which had plagued him for over a decade, had grown monstrous. Each time physicians cut it open to drain the pus, they released a stench, foul beyond all reason, one servant wrote. The leg swelled to twice its size, blackened and cracked. Blood and yellow fluid seeped through the bandages. And when the king moved, it bled anew, as if the body itself refused to hold together. He could no longer stand. He could barely breathe. His body had become a swollen monument to his gluttony and sin, massive, misshapen wheezing. Servants struggled to roll him in bed. They used cranes to lift him into chairs. He slept surrounded by candles, priests, and the stifling fear of those who tended him. No one dared to speak of death in his presence, for in Tudor law to predict the death of the king was treason. And so, while his flesh decayed, everyone pretended he was only ill. Doctors murmured hopeful lies. Courtiers bowed and smiled through tears. But the truth was visible to all. The king was rotting alive. When he ate, food dribbled down his beard, staining his robes. His breath was so putrid that even physicians turned away. The ulcers on his legs burst frequently, soaking the bed sheets. His attendants burned them after each night, afraid of infection, or perhaps of the curse that clung to him. At times, the stench was so overpowering that visitors fainted. Dogs refused to enter his chambers. Even the tapestries on the walls began to smell of decay. Henry's temper flared violently during these final months. He accused everyone, his physicians, his servants, even his wife Catherine Parr, of plotting his death. His mind, already clouded by pain and fever, turned every kindness into a conspiracy. He raged against the dying of his strength. He cursed his body for betraying him, cursed the doctors who could not cure him, cursed God himself for sending no relief. But beneath the fury lay fear, pure, paralyzing fear. For Henry knew what awaited him. He had ordered hundreds to death, burned, beheaded, tortured. He had ripped a kingdom from its faith and claimed the throne of God himself. And now, that same God was silent. Every breath became a battle. Every night, a test of endurance. The king who once commanded empires could not command his own body to stop dying. By January 1547, he was confined to his bed, swollen, delirious, and stinking of death. The courtiers began to speak in whispers once more, not of war, not of wives, but of what would happen when the king finally stopped breathing. January 27, 1547, the night before the end. King Henry VIII lay upon his massive bed in Whitehall Palace, the same bed where he had once laughed, ruled, and sinned. Now, he was barely a shadow beneath the weight of blankets. The room was thick with the smell of incense and infection. Candles lined the walls, their wax pooling like melting flesh. Outside, London slept under snow. But inside the palace, no one dared to rest. Doctors stood by with trembling hands. Priests whispered prayers that even they no longer believed would be answered. Each time the king moved, a groan escaped his throat, half pain, half fear. The once mighty ruler who had commanded armies, defied popes, and executed queens could no longer lift his own hand. His fingers were swollen. His face had turned pale and waxy. He could not speak without gasping, as if every word scraped against his chest. All night he drifted in and out of delirium. He muttered names: Catherine, Mary, Jane, Thomas, Anne, a roll call of the dead. Sometimes he wept. Sometimes he cursed. At one point he called for Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the man who had helped him build the Church of England. Cranmer hurried to the bedside, his face pale, his hands shaking. The king's eyes fluttered open, cloudy, confused, half-blind. Cranmer knelt. "Your Majesty," he whispered, "do you die in the faith of Christ?" Henry tried to speak, but no sound came, only a faint movement of his lips. Cranmer leaned closer, and the king, with the last strength he had, squeezed the archbishop's hand. That silent gesture, that faint, desperate pressure, was the last act of the man who had torn apart Christendom. The priest said it was a sign of repentance. Others believed it was fear. Perhaps it was both. Those who watched said his eyes darted around the room in his final moments, as if searching for something or someone. And some swore that, for just a heartbeat, his lips curved into a faint, broken smile. Whether it was relief or madness, no one ever knew. As midnight passed into dawn, Henry slipped into unconsciousness. The crackle of fire dimmed. The air grew still. Even the flies were silent. He whispered a final haunting word. Monks. Perhaps he was calling out to the monks he had ordered slain when he destroyed the monasteries. Perhaps he saw them, the ghosts of those he had damned, standing at the edge of his bed, waiting. Then came the long silence. His chest rose, fell, and stopped. The courtiers did not move. No one dared to speak. They waited hours before declaring what they already knew. The King of England was dead. The tyrant was dead, but his shadow wasn't. When King Henry VIII finally took his last breath in January 1547, England did not rejoice. It exhaled. After years of terror, executions, and endless decrees written in his name, the land was finally still. But death for Henry was not a clean escape. It was a continuation. For 2 days his corpse lay in Whitehall Palace. No one dared move it. The doctors had gone. The priests whispered. The courtiers stayed far from the bed. Even in death, the king terrified them. His body had already begun to swell. The smell was unbearable. His face darkened. His lips cracked open. The bloated frame that had once sat upon a golden throne now looked like it was melting, consumed by the same disease and corruption that had ruled his soul. When they finally placed his body into a lead coffin, the stench filled the entire chamber. They sealed it shut with melted wax and carried it through the halls by torchlight. The procession began. Dozens of horses, mourners, and guards followed the coffin south, to Windsor, where he would be buried beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he had ever truly loved. But as they traveled through the countryside, the unthinkable happened. Somewhere near Sion Abbey, the procession stopped for the night. The coffin was left in a cold chapel until morning, and during that night, the lead coffin began to leak. Those who came to pray found dark fluid seeping onto the floor, a thick, blood-colored ooze spilling from the seams of the king's tomb. The smell was unbearable. And then came the legend. A monk who witnessed it claimed that stray dogs had wandered into the chapel, drawn by the scent, and began licking the blood from the floor beneath the coffin. The same monk whispered that it was God's punishment, echoing the words once spoken by Henry's enemies. "He shall lie like a dog, and dogs shall lick his blood." A prophecy fulfilled. When the news spread, even his most loyal servants crossed themselves in fear. They buried him quickly afterward, deep within St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. No grand feast, no public ceremony, just a hurried burial for a king who had once believed himself chosen by God. Over the years, the stories only grew darker. Some said his tomb was cursed, that no monument was ever completed above it because no one dared finish it. Others claimed that at night, you could still hear the sound of heavy footsteps in the crypt, and a voice whispering the names of his wives. Henry VIII's death was not simply the end of a man, it was the end of an age of blood, power, and fear. He left behind a kingdom divided, a church built on rebellion, and a legacy dripping with guilt. The man who had called himself defender of the faith died hated by the faith he once claimed to defend. And though centuries have passed, his death remains one of the most grotesque and symbolic endings in royal history. A king devoured by the very corruption he created. Every empire ends in silence. Every crown, no matter how bright, eventually rusts. King Henry VIII began as a golden prince, handsome, educated, adored by his people. He was supposed to be England's shining hope, but power does not illuminate, it burns. And Henry let it consume him. He built his throne on faith, love, and blood. He destroyed what he could not control, and he called it God's will. 6 wives, thousands of executions, an entire religion torn apart, all to feed the hunger of one man's will. And in the end, the throne took everything back. By his final days, Henry was not a man. He was a carcass of power, rotting from within. His heart hardened by guilt, his soul haunted by the ghosts of those he betrayed. The queen he beheaded, the friends he destroyed, the faith he shattered. Each sin carved into his flesh until his body became a reflection of his soul. Those who saw him in those last weeks whispered that God himself had judged him early, that no punishment on earth could match what he had already become. After his death, England trembled in uncertainty. His only son, Edward, was too young to rule. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, would inherit the broken fragments of his dream and spend decades trying to rebuild what he had torn apart. Henry's name became legend, not as a hero, not even as a king, but as a warning. Beware the man who believes he can command God. 4 centuries later, his tomb still lies silent in St. George's Chapel beneath the cold stone floor. There is no towering monument, no golden statue, no echo of music or prayer. Only the sound of footsteps from tourists passing above, unaware that beneath their feet lies one of history's most terrifying lessons. Because Henry VIII's story is not just about a king who fell. It's about power itself, and what it does to the human soul when it goes unchecked. Power is seductive. It convinces us we are chosen. It makes us forget that kings too are made of flesh, and in the end, flesh always decays. In the end, the King of England rotted like any other man. His throne turned to dust, his crown turned to rust, and his name became a whisper in the corridors of death.